The night I opened my husband's safe, my hands shook so violently I could barely turn the combination dial. For nearly 40 years, Richard Holmes had spent every single day telling me that we were barely scraping by. Yet, inside that hidden safe sat stacks of cash, investment accounts, and a secret life tied to another woman's name. I didn't scream. I didn't take a single dollar. Instead, I slid a sealed envelope into the safe, divorce papers, with his signature line already filled out exactly where my lawyer told me to put it. Then I locked it back up and left him to discover the truth all on his own. Lonely, afraid, and entirely too late. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you something. Have you ever discovered that the person you trusted most was hiding an entirely different life from you? If you have, tell me in the comments. I read every single one because stories like ours deserve to be heard. And if you're watching tonight, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is over there. If you love emotional stories about family betrayal and finding your strength again, don't forget to like and subscribe. If you asked anyone on our block what they thought of Richard Holmes, they'd smile before you even finished the sentence. Richard? Oh, he's a great guy, they'd always say. And for most of my life, I said the exact same thing. We lived in Columbus, Ohio, in a quiet brick house with white shutters and rose bushes I planted with my own hands nearly 30 years ago. Richard worked in financial management for a manufacturing company downtown. He always wore perfectly ironed button-down shirts, balanced every checkbook down to the penny, and never forgot anyone's birthday. At church, people shook his hand like he was some kind of saint. At family dinners, our son Daniel treated his advice like gospel. Even our daughter Megan used to say, "Dad always knows what to do." I used to believe that too. Back then, I thought being a good husband meant being stable, predictable, paying the bills on time, and keeping the lights on. And Richard did all of that. What I didn't realize was that stability can sometimes become a cage, one built so quietly that you don't even notice the bars until decades later. When our kids were small, I worked part-time at a dental clinic. I loved that job. I loved talking to people, getting dressed up, and having that sense of independence. But when Daniel started school, Richard sat me down at the kitchen table one night, his hands folded like he was presenting a serious business proposal. "It just makes more sense financially if you stay home," he said. I remember laughing softly. "Financially?" "Richard, daycare isn't that expensive." "It's not just daycare," he answered calmly. "It's gas, clothes, eating out, the stress. If one of us focuses entirely on the home, we'll save so much more." One of us. It certainly wasn't going to be him. It was me. At the time, it sounded logical, even responsible. That was Richard's gift. He could wrap control and logic so perfectly that you felt guilty for even questioning him. So I quit. Slowly, my life outside the house faded away. At first, I didn't mind. I genuinely loved raising our children. I packed their lunches, volunteered for school events, and sat on folding chairs wrapped in blankets during freezing Ohio football games. But as the years passed, something shifted. Richard took over all the finances, every account, every investment, every tax form. If I asked questions, his answers were so fast and confident that I felt foolish for even bringing it up. "We're doing okay, Carly, but we have to be careful." That phrase became the background noise of my marriage. We have to be careful. So I learned to shrink my desires. I bought my sweaters from clearance racks. I dyed my own hair in the bathroom to save money. I clipped coupons, and Richard would praise me for being so financially smart. Looking back now, I realized something painful. He liked me small, not physically, but financially, emotionally, and socially. A small woman is much easier to manage. Strangely, I don't think Richard ever raised his voice at me, not enough for anyone to call him cruel. That's why the manipulation was so confusing for all those years. He wasn't a monster. He was patient, reserved, and cautious, which somehow made the control even harder to see. Every time I brought up taking a vacation, he'd sigh. Maybe next year. Every time I talked about remodeling the kitchen, he'd frown. Not wise right now. When our roof started leaking, Richard patched it himself instead of hiring professionals. "We can't afford to throw money away unnecessarily," he said. And I believed him, because why wouldn't I? He was the financial expert. I was just a wife who hadn't worked in decades. About 5 years ago, I remember standing in a department store, holding a beautiful navy blue dress. It wasn't extravagant, just elegant, and putting it on made me feel alive again. I looked at the price tag, $120. Before I could even make up my mind, Richard glanced over, chuckling softly. "Carly, for that price, you'll wear it twice at most." I put it right back. I still remember the heat of embarrassment in my cheeks as younger women walked past me carrying shopping bags without a second thought. At the time, I told myself Richard was just being practical. Now I understand something else. A man who constantly reminds you of what you can't afford eventually trains you to stop asking. The older I got, the more invisible I became in my own marriage. Yet on the surface, everything looked flawless. Sunday dinners, holiday photos, anniversary dinners at the exact same steakhouse every April. Richard held my hand in public. Richard called me sweetheart. Richard opened the car door for me. That's the terrifying thing about emotional control. From the outside, it rarely looks ugly. The first real crack appeared about 2 years ago. I woke up around midnight and found Richard gone from the bed. I walked downstairs, expecting to find him asleep in front of the TV. Instead, I saw a sliver of light coming from beneath his office door. Richard had always been protective of that room. Not aggressively, just territorial. He kept the tax records, work files, and investment documents in there. I respected his privacy. Married people are still allowed to have personal space, or so I told myself. But that night, it felt strange. Walking quietly to the door, I heard drawers opening and papers rustling. Then, complete silence. Before I could even knock, the light went out instantly. A second later, Richard swung the door open, startling me. Tension gripped his face for a split second before smoothing back into his familiar smile. "Everything okay?" he asked. I nodded slowly. I was about to ask you the same thing. Just organizing some paperwork. At midnight. He chuckled softly. "You know me. I can't sleep if the numbers don't balance." I forced a smile, but as he walked past me toward the stairs, I noticed something I never had before. He locked the office door, fully locked it. Long after he went upstairs, I stood there staring at that brass handle. That moment should have raised far more alarms. But after decades of making excuses for uncomfortable feelings, your intuition goes numb. You stop listening to yourself. Still, something had changed. After that night, I started noticing things I couldn't ignore. Whenever the mail arrived, Richard became incredibly anxious. He started shredding documents immediately. Sometimes he'd walk outside just to take a phone call. Every time I unexpectedly walked into his office, he'd minimize whatever was on his computer screen with a speed that felt rehearsed. One afternoon, while dusting the hallway bookshelf, I overheard him speaking in a harsh, hushed whisper on the phone. "I already transferred it," he hissed. A pause. "No, she doesn't know a thing." My stomach tightened instantly. She, not Carly. She. Before he could catch me listening, I backed away. At dinner that night, Richard casually talked about the church renovation while buttering his bread as if nothing had happened. For the first time in nearly 40 years of marriage, I looked at the man sitting across the table and realized I no longer knew him at all. Weeks after I heard Richard whispering on the phone, Megan showed up at our front door, her eyes swollen, holding a cardboard box filled with her son's clothes. I opened the door and knew instantly something was terribly wrong. "Megan." She tried to smile, but her lip trembled. "Can Liam stay here tonight?" Behind her stood my 8-year-old grandson, clutching a backpack that was almost as big as he was. My heart sank. "What's going on?" Megan looked completely drained, a kind of exhaustion that only heartbreak and fear can cause. Her blonde hair was tied in a messy knot, and she had dark circles under her eyes that I had never seen before. "Tyler cleaned out the joint account," she whispered. "He hired a lawyer yesterday." Before she could even finish, I pulled her into my arms. "Oh, honey." That night, after Liam fell asleep in the guest room, Megan sat at our kitchen table, crying over an untouched cup of tea while Richard listened with his arms crossed. "I just need a little help," she sobbed. "Just until I can get things sorted out." Richard leaned back slowly. "How much are we talking about?" Megan hesitated. "Probably $5,000, just for the retainer and rent." I already knew what I wanted to say. Of course we would help her. She was our daughter. But before I could speak, Richard let out a heavy sigh. "Megan, I'm sorry, but we really can't afford to just give out money like that right now." I stared at him. Give out money. Megan blinked rapidly, trying hard not to cry again. "Dad, I'm not asking for a vacation. I'm trying to protect my son." Richard rubbed his forehead as if she were causing him personal stress. "I understand, but sometimes people need to face the consequences of their choices." The room went dead silent. Not even the faint sound of Liam's cartoons upstairs could soften the cruelty of those words. Megan immediately lowered her head, and I could practically see the humiliation washing over her. "Consequences?" I asked carefully. Richard turned to me, completely calm. "She ignored the warning signs with Tyler for years." I felt a sudden surge of anger in my chest that shocked even me. She's terrified, Richard, and throwing money at a problem doesn't fix it. Megan stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. You know what? She whispered, her voice trembling. Forget I even asked. Megan, I started. No, it's fine. But it wasn't fine, not even close. I followed her to the hallway as she grabbed Liam's coat. Honey, listen to me. She avoided my eyes. I shouldn't have come here. No, you should have. I'm 34 years old, begging my own father for help. Her voice broke on the last word, and that sound haunted me for weeks. I shoved the small amount of emergency cash I kept hidden in an old coffee can in the laundry room into her hands. $900. Money I had secretly saved from grocery budgets and birthday checks over the years. It wasn't enough, not even close, but Megan cried like I had given her a fortune. Meanwhile, Richard stood in the kitchen pretending to read the newspaper while our daughter walked out into the night, feeling completely abandoned. That was the first night I truly couldn't sleep next to my husband. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan, memories replaying endlessly in my mind. Not just that conversation, but every conversation before it. All the times Richard said no. No to helping Megan pay off her college loans, no to fixing the upstairs bathroom properly, no to replacing our aging car until it practically broke down in traffic. No to vacations, no to retirement trips, no to unnecessary spending. Always no, always cautious, always sacrifice. And somehow the sacrifice was almost always mine. The next morning, I found Richard drinking coffee at the kitchen island as if nothing had happened. You were too harsh on her, I said softly. He didn't even look up from his tablet. She needed honesty. She needed support. She is completely overwhelmed. I stared at him in disbelief. She is getting a divorce. And whose fault is that? Hearing those words, something inside me quietly snapped. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just enough to leave a permanent crack. She is your daughter, I whispered. Richard finally looked at me. And I love her enough not to enable irresponsible behavior. That phrase sat uneasily with me all day. Enabling. Irresponsible. Richard always had a way of turning empathy into a weakness. By afternoon, I found myself thinking back to another memory from a few years ago. I had cracked a molar and needed dental work that insurance only partially covered. Richard complained about the expense for weeks. We have to prioritize, he had said. Yet, that very same year, he somehow bought himself a brand new fishing boat, claiming he got an unbelievable discount. I used to accept those explanations. But the strange thing about waking up to manipulation is that your entire past begins to rearrange itself. Moments you once ignored suddenly flash with warning lights. That evening, Richard left the house to have dinner with friends from church. I stayed home folding laundry, the old thoughts spinning endlessly in my head. As I bent down to grab one of Richard's shirts from the basket, something slid from the pocket and hit the floor. A folded bank deposit slip. I almost ignored it. Almost. But the bank logo caught my attention immediately. I frowned. It wasn't our bank. Picking it up slowly, I felt my stomach drop at the deposit amount. $8,400. I checked the account number, completely unfamiliar. Then I saw the date, 3 days ago. My heart began to race. Richard had deposited over $8,000 into an account I knew absolutely nothing about, all while telling our daughter we didn't have the money to help her with legal fees. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table because my knees had suddenly gone weak. Maybe there was an explanation, I told myself initially. There was always an explanation, but deep down, a different feeling had already taken root. Fear. Not of losing money, but fear that my entire marriage was built on information I was never allowed to see. When Richard came home later that night, I watched him more closely than ever before. The way he unfolded his tie, the way he privately checked his phone screen, the way he carried himself with a quiet confidence. For decades, I had mistaken that confidence for honesty. Now I wasn't so sure. Around midnight, I woke up thirsty and went downstairs to grab a glass of water. That's when I heard Richard's voice again. Low, sharp, and this time coming from the garage. I froze near the hallway. I told you she doesn't know, he whispered angrily. A silence followed. No, keep things where they are for now. My hands began to shake instantly. Keep things where they are? What things? Before I could stop myself, I moved closer. Then I heard a single name. Linda. It was just one word, but it hit my chest like a stone because I recognized it. Not fully, not clearly, but enough to know I had heard Richard mention that name years ago. Extremely casually, very briefly, too briefly. A cold sensation slowly spread through my entire body. And for the first time in nearly 40 years of marriage, I seriously wondered if my husband had a completely different life I knew absolutely nothing about. For the next few days after hearing Richard whisper the name Linda on the phone, I went through the motions of a normal life. That's the strange part. You can discover something deeply unsettling about your marriage and still find yourself making coffee the next morning as if your world hasn't tilted. I still watered the roses, still folded Richard's shirts, and still smiled politely at the neighbors walking their dogs past our house. But something restless inside me had woken up. I started paying attention. Truly paying attention. And once I did, I realized Richard had been hiding a part of himself for years. Every time I walked into his office unexpectedly, he would tense up. If I knocked, he answered too quickly. If I lingered nearby, he always found a reason to leave the room. One afternoon, I walked in carrying a basket of clean towels and found him hurriedly shoving papers into a drawer. He looked startled. "Didn't hear you come in," he said, his voice sounding entirely too casual. I glanced at the desk. "What are you working on? Taxes?" "It's September." He forced a rigid smile. "You can never be too far ahead with taxes." Then he immediately stood up and took the laundry basket from my hands, physically guiding me out of the room. A tiny moment, but suddenly, every tiny moment mattered immensely. A few nights later, I was sitting in bed reading while Richard showered in the guest bathroom because our master bath was undergoing repairs. His phone, which he had left on the nightstand next to me, vibrated. Normally, I never touched his phone, never even thought to. But after nearly 40 years of marriage, suspicion changes your moral boundaries in ways you never see coming. The screen lit up briefly. No message preview, just a single name. Linda G. My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the screen as the phone continued to hum against the wood before going dark again. A minute later, Richard walked back into the bedroom, drying his hair with a towel. I looked up calmly. "Your phone vibrated." He froze for a fraction of a second, then smiled. "Probably just spam. Spam doesn't usually come with a first name and a last initial," but I didn't say a word. This was becoming my new survival strategy. Silence, observation, and waiting. A few days later, Richard left for a church fundraising dinner downtown. Before leaving, he stood in front of the hallway mirror, adjusting his tie. "Are you going to stay up late?" he asked. "Probably not. You should get some rest." He mechanically kissed my forehead, a routine gesture. Mechanical. Then he grabbed his jacket and left. The moment I heard the garage door close, I felt the tension in my chest tighten. Because for the first time in our marriage, I had already decided I was going into his office. I stood outside that locked door for nearly a full minute before opening the small cabinet in the hallway where Richard kept the spare keys. My hands shook so badly I almost dropped them. A part of me still felt like this was ridiculous. Maybe there was an innocent explanation for all of it. Maybe Linda was a financial client. Maybe that hidden account was work-related. Maybe I was turning into one of those paranoid wives from a television drama. But another part of me already knew better. I opened the office door slowly. The room smelled of leather, paper, and Richard's cologne. Everything looked painfully organized. The books were lined up flawlessly, the pens sat neatly next to the computer, and the filing cabinet carried perfectly typed labels. Richard loved control, and now I saw it everywhere. I moved carefully to the desk, opening the drawers one by one. Tax records, insurance forms, retirement statements. Nothing shocking, nothing out of the ordinary. Then I noticed the large filing cabinet against the wall. I had looked at it thousands of times over the years, but something about it felt wrong now. Maybe it sat slightly further from the wall than it used to. Maybe it was just the fact that Richard had recently become so obsessed with locking this room. I dropped to my knees slowly. That's when I saw it. A small steel safe, hidden directly behind the filing cabinet. For a second, I couldn't breathe. My stomach twisted so sharply I had to grab the edge of the desk to steady myself. Richard had a safe. A hidden safe that, after nearly 4 decades of marriage, I had never known existed. I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't large, just big enough for documents, cash, maybe jewelry, or secrets. Especially secrets. I knelt before it carefully, my trembling fingers touching the cold metal surface. It had a digital keypad requiring 4 numbers. I almost laughed to myself in bitter realization. Of course Richard would secure it carefully. The truth about everything lay inside that box, and I had absolutely no way of opening it. Or so I thought. The next few days became unbearable because I couldn't stop thinking about it. The safe followed me everywhere, while grocery shopping, while folding towels. Even during church service, when Pastor William spoke about honesty and trust, I found myself glancing at Richard sitting beside me, wondering just how many lies a marriage could hold before completely collapsing. Then, something happened that changed everything. A week later, Richard came home from another church event smelling faintly of whiskey. He wasn't drunk, just relaxed enough to be careless. He rarely drank that much, which made his behavior feel even stranger. That night, around midnight, I woke up to find his side of the bed empty once again. I slipped downstairs quietly. Light spilled from beneath the office door. Moving silently across the hallway until I reached that small gap near the doorframe, I saw him. Richard was crouching in front of the safe, the filing cabinet pushed aside. He was humming a quiet tune while casually pressing the digits. My heart beat so loudly I thought he'd hear it. Then the safe clicked open. Leaning in slightly, desperate to see the keypad, I caught the numbers just as he paused for a brief second. I froze instantly. 0419. No, it couldn't be. Then it clicked. It was April 19th. A birthday. But not mine. Not Megan's. Not Daniel's. Nobody in our family was born on April 19th. A chill ran straight through me as I suddenly remembered where I had heard that date years ago. It was at a company retirement dinner. Richard had mentioned that Linda Graves shared a birthday with a baseball player they joked about. I only remembered because Linda herself had laughed loudly about it, saying it was a date you couldn't forget. I hadn't thought about that woman in years. Until now. Richard closed the safe abruptly, and I slipped backward before he could see me in the doorway. My hands were ice cold as I hurried upstairs, pretending to be asleep when he came back to bed 10 minutes later. But inside, my mind was spinning frantically. Why would my husband lock a hidden safe with another woman's birthday? Not our anniversary? Not his own birthday? Not mine. Hers. It meant something. It had to. And for the first time, a terrifying possibility entered my mind completely. Maybe this wasn't just hidden money. Maybe Richard hadn't just hidden finances. Maybe he had been hiding an entire relationship for years. I stayed awake until sunrise, staring at the ceiling while Richard slept soundly beside me, all while thinking one single thing. If the secret inside that safe was powerful enough to dictate the combination to my husband's life, what on earth was hidden inside it? For 3 whole days after discovering the combination to the safe, I did absolutely nothing. On the surface, at least. I still made dinner, still asked Richard if he wanted potatoes or rice, and still smiled politely when Daniel called to talk about work. But in my head, everything had turned into white noise. Linda Graves. The name repeated like a song I couldn't shut off. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe Richard just had a fondness for her years ago. Maybe the birthday meant nothing. But deep down, a woman knows when something is wrong, and this smelled of rot from beginning to end. One afternoon, while Richard was out playing golf with friends from church, I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at my laptop for nearly 20 minutes before finally typing her name into Facebook. Linda Graves. Hundreds of results appeared, and I almost closed the browser. A part of me didn't actually want to know, because suspicion is painful, but certainty can destroy you. Still, I kept searching. Eventually, I found her. Linda Graves, Cincinnati, Ohio, 63 years old. My chest tightened instantly. Her profile picture showed a woman standing near a small garden, wearing jeans and a faded blue sweatshirt. Gray blonde hair, a thin face, and tired eyes. She didn't look glamorous. She didn't look like the kind of woman a man leaves his wife for. Honestly, she looked lonely. I clicked through her photos slowly. No lavish vacations, no expensive jewelry, no signs of a secret romantic life with a husband, just ordinary things. A small dog, pictures of flowers, an occasional church bake sale. Yet Richard used her birthday to lock a hidden safe. I leaned back in my chair, confused. Everything about this woman contradicted the image of a socialite I had formed in my mind. Then I noticed something else. An old photo from nearly 15 years ago. A company retirement party. My heart sank. Richard was standing in the background, smiling right next to her. I zoomed in on the image. His arm was resting lightly across her back, far too comfortably, far too intimately. Suddenly, I remembered that night vividly. Richard had been downtown for that corporate event, and I had stayed home with Megan after her appendix surgery. I remember him mentioning Linda afterward. She handled the accounting audits, he had said casually. That was it. One sentence. Easily forgotten over nearly 40 years of marriage. But here she was again, hidden behind locked doors and whispered phone calls. I kept scrolling down, and then I noticed something even stranger. Linda's profile occasionally mentioned financial struggles, car trouble, medical bills, even taking on part-time work in her 60s. It didn't make sense. If Richard had been secretly involved with this woman financially for years, why did she still look like she was struggling, unless the money wasn't for romance? The possibility left me even more unsettled. That night, I barely touched my dinner, and Richard noticed immediately. "You okay, Carly?" "Just tired." He studied me across the table. "You've seemed distant lately." I forced a laugh. "Maybe I'm just getting old." "You're not old." It's funny how a man can say that while slowly making a woman feel entirely invisible. Richard went back to eating, and I watched him silently. How many lies can a person tell before they no longer recognize themselves? Or worse, before their spouse doesn't recognize them? Later that night, after he fell asleep, I went back downstairs with my laptop. This time, I searched public records, property deeds, business registrations, anything tied to Linda Graves. Eventually, I found it. A business name I recognized instantly. Harrison Financial Consulting. Richard had mentioned it after his early retirement from the corporate position, a small partnership for part-time consulting that he claimed brought in barely any money. I clicked deeper into the filings, my pulse quickening. Linda Graves' name appeared on old documents tied to that business. Not Richard's, hers. I stared at the screen, completely baffled. Why would her name be on corporate documents for a business my husband operated financially? Then another terrifying thought entered my mind. What if Richard had been using her to hide money all along? The idea sounded insane, yet suddenly, every strange moment from the last decade began to fit together perfectly. The secret bank accounts, the hidden safe, the whispered phone calls, and his constant obsession with keeping financial control entirely in his own hands. I shut the laptop abruptly because my hands were shaking too badly to type anymore. Right at that moment, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Richard? I quickly closed the browser just as he appeared in the kitchen doorway in his pajama pants, looking sleepy. "Coming to bed soon?" His eyes drifted to the laptop. "What are you doing up so late anyway?" "Oh, nothing. Just looking at things." For a terrifying second, I thought he knew. I thought he could somehow read everything written on my face. But he just nodded and walked to the fridge. "You worry too much lately," he said casually. That sentence hit me harder than it should have, because that had always been Richard's strategy. If I questioned something, I was being emotional. If I noticed an inconsistency, I was being anxious. If I felt hurt, I was overreacting. Meanwhile, he remained the calm, logical, reasonable one. Once you convince someone their instincts are flawed, controlling them becomes incredibly easy. The next morning, Megan called, crying again. Tyler's lawyer had filed aggressive custody papers, and she sounded completely overwhelmed. "I don't know how I'm going to pay for this," she whispered. I sat in my car outside the grocery store, gripping the steering wheel, listening to my daughter on the brink of an emotional breakdown while my mind focused entirely on that hidden deposit slip, $8,400. Richard had transferred secret funds without a single ounce of guilt while his own daughter was drowning. The confusion finally began to give way to anger. Real anger. Not suspicion, not fear. Anger. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I drove to the bank branch listed on the deposit slip tied to Richard's secret account. Not to confront anyone, but just to see it. The building sat in a quiet commercial plaza on the other side of town. Small, private, and entirely inconspicuous. Parking across the street, I stared at it through the windshield. Richard had built an entire financial life in places I didn't even know existed. Suddenly, for the first time in my marriage, I felt humiliated. Not because of another woman, and not because of money, but because I had trusted someone entirely while they quietly arranged their life behind locked doors. Returning home emotionally exhausted, I found Richard already there, standing in the kitchen sorting through the mail. The moment he saw me, he quickly flipped an envelope face down. The movement was too fast. There it was again. The panic, the tension. I walked slowly to the counter. "Anything important?" "No," he answered instantly. Too fast. Then his phone buzzed, and he grabbed it with a speed that felt like a reflex. Before he turned away, I saw the screen. Linda G. This time, Richard walked into the hallway to take it privately. Standing alone in the kitchen, I realized something awful. I wasn't afraid of finding out the truth anymore. I was afraid of how long I had ignored it. Because deep down, I began to understand a painful reality. The ultimate betrayal wasn't the money, and it wasn't even the lies. It was realizing that Richard had spent years carefully ensuring I remained dependent enough that I would never think to question him. And for the first time in nearly 40 years, I was finally questioning everything. A week after I drove past the bank branch tied to Richard's secret account, Megan called me from a grocery store parking lot, crying so hard I could barely understand her. "I got rejected again," she whispered. "For what? The apartment?" I closed my eyes instantly. "Oh, honey." They ran my credit after Tyler stopped paying the joint card. The landlord says I need a co-signer now. Behind her voice, I could hear Liam quietly asking if they were still getting pizza tonight. It broke me. Megan lowered her voice. I'm trying, Mom. I'm really trying. I know you are. No, you don't understand. I'm empty. I sat alone in my bedroom, gripping the phone. I worked a double yesterday. Liam had a fever last night, and then Tyler's lawyer sent more papers this morning. Her breath hitched. And Dad still thinks this is some kind of lesson. That sentence felt like a slap in the face because deep down, she was right. Richard wasn't just refusing to help. He was judging her, punishing her somehow, as if struggle only builds character when someone else is suffering. I will figure something out, I told her softly. How? I had no answer because I didn't know. After hanging up, I sat perfectly still for a long time, staring at the bedroom wall. Then slowly the memories began to surface, one after another. The sacrifices, all of them. I remembered when Daniel broke his arm 15 years ago and insurance wouldn't cover all of it, and I sold my grandmother's bracelet. Richard insisted finances were tight, so I sold it quietly without telling the kids. I remembered working extra hours secretly at a florist one winter just to buy Megan the laptop she needed for college, which Richard had called an unnecessary expense. I remembered clipping coupons while Richard lectured us on discipline. And all those years, he was hiding money. The anger moving through me now felt different than before. Cleaner somehow, less cluttered. Because once you stop making excuses for the person hurting you, betrayal becomes much easier to read. That night, Richard sat in his recliner watching cable news while I stood in the kitchen staring at the back of his head. I realized something strange. I wasn't afraid of him anymore. For decades, Richard's confidence dictated the emotional temperature of our house. If he frowned, everyone walked on eggshells. If he approved, everyone relaxed. But now I saw something else, a man terrified of losing control. Did Megan call? He asked without turning around. Yes. How is she holding up? The casualness in his voice irritated me instantly. She got rejected for another apartment. Richard let out a dramatic sigh. Well, these things take time. I stared at him in disbelief. These things. He finally muted the TV and turned his head. What do you want me to say, Carly? I want you to care about her. That's not fair. No, I said calmly. What's not fair is watching your daughter struggle while you act like empathy is a financial weakness. His expression hardened instantly. There is a difference between helping someone and enabling them. There was that word again. Enabling. I stepped closer. Did anyone ever help you when you were young? Richard frowned. That was different. Why? Because everything I have, I earned by working hard. Megan has been working hard too. I wanted to scream, but I just crossed my arms tightly. She is drowning, Richard, and refusing to pull her out doesn't teach her stability. I watched my husband for a long moment before speaking again. You know what's strange? The way you talk about money makes it sound like there's never enough. His eyes narrowed slightly. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing. But something shifted in the look on his face. Suspicion for a brief second, but it was there. And for the first time, I realized Richard was beginning to feel my distance too. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m, I walked downstairs and stood in the dark kitchen drinking water, the moonlight reflecting off the tile floor. I thought about my entire adult life, how carefully I had shaped myself around Richard's comfort. I stopped spending, stopped questioning, and stopped expecting. Without even knowing it, I had slowly become a person who apologized for needing anything at all. Once I understood that, another painful truth surfaced right behind it. Richard benefited from my insecurity. The next afternoon, while cleaning out the hallway closet, I found an old plastic bin filled with tax records and family documents from years ago. Normally, I would have ignored it, but instead, I sat cross-legged on the floor and started reading. Most of it looked routine. Mortgage statements, insurance renewals, medical receipts. Then I found an old tax document from nearly 8 years ago. At first, I almost missed it. A single investment entry in small print, Harrison Financial Consulting, LLC. My pulse quickened instantly. I flipped through more documents quickly. Another mention appeared 2 years later, then another. The investment amounts weren't small either. Several $1,000s, maybe more. Yet Richard had always described that consulting firm as completely inactive. My breath grew shallow because I suddenly understood something terrifying. Richard wasn't just hiding money now. He had been secretly building something for years, maybe even decades. I made copies of the documents on our old printer, my hands shaking the entire time. Then I hid the copies in a recipe box in the pantry, right behind recipes I never used. The fact that I was secretly hiding evidence against my husband made me sick to my stomach, but what felt worse was realizing I didn't trust him at all. Later that night, Daniel came over unexpectedly and hugged Richard first. Of course he did. My son adored his father and always had. Richard taught him to drive, coached his baseball team, and helped him buy his first apartment. Meanwhile, I prepared lunches and then quietly faded into the background, as mothers often do. Daniel sat at the kitchen island eating leftover lasagna while talking about work frustrations, and eventually, Megan's situation came up. She's too emotional, Richard said calmly, and I almost dropped my fork. Daniel nodded slowly. Divorce is always a mess. What she needs right now is structure, Richard continued, not handouts. I watched my son, waiting for him to disagree, but he didn't. Suddenly, I saw how deeply Richard's mindset had shaped this family. Emotion became weakness, need became irresponsibility, and control became wisdom. I excused myself early that night, going upstairs before either man could notice the tears gathering in my eyes. In the bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the family photos on the dresser. 38 years of memories smiling back at me. Vacations, Christmas mornings, birthdays, anniversaries. For the first time, I asked myself a question I had been too afraid to consider before. Had Richard ever truly seen me as an equal partner? Or was I just a reliable woman who made his life easier while he quietly protected himself behind locked doors? A few minutes later, I heard Richard coming upstairs. He walked into the bedroom, loosening his tie. You're quiet tonight. I'm tired. He studied me closely. You seem different lately. I looked right at him, more directly than I had in years. Maybe I'm finally starting to pay attention. For a split second, something flickered across his face. Fear. Tiny, but real. In that exact moment, I knew with absolute certainty that whatever Richard Holmes was hiding, it was big enough that he was afraid of losing control too. The night I finally opened Richard's safe, it was pouring rain outside, and the windows rattled slightly with each gust of wind. Richard had left an hour earlier for a late church financial committee meeting downtown. He kissed my cheek before leaving and asked if I wanted him to bring back takeout when he was done. I almost laughed at the normalcy of it all. Standing there looking at the man who had quietly lied to me for years, watching him worry about whether I wanted chicken parmigiana or soup. I'm fine, I told him. Don't stay out too late. Then he walked out the front door with his umbrella, just like any ordinary husband on any ordinary night. The moment his car disappeared down the street, the silence in the house changed, becoming heavier, somehow filled with finality. I stood in the kitchen gripping the counter, my heart slamming against my ribs. A part of me still wanted to stop because once you uncover the truth, you can never go back to not knowing it. But another part of me, the part that was exhausted, humiliated, and furious, needed answers more than comfort. I walked slowly toward Richard's office, each step feeling surreal. The hallway lights cast soft yellow shadows on the wall while rain drummed against the glass. Opening the office door carefully, I pushed the filing cabinet aside. There it was, the safe. Cold steel hidden behind decades of marriage. My hands shook as I knelt before it, the keypad beeping softly under my fingers. 0419. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then a click. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot, and I froze completely. Even knowing Richard wasn't home, guilt rushed over me automatically. That's what happens when you spend years carefully living around someone else's rules. Slowly, I pulled the safe door open, and I knew instantly that my marriage was over. Inside sat stacks of cash, neatly bound with bank paper bands. It wasn't a few $1,000s or emergency savings. It was a massive amount of money. My stomach twisted sharply. Reaching out with trembling fingers, I touched one of the stacks, $50 bills with hundreds beneath them. There had to be tens of thousands of dollars sitting in front of me, maybe more. All those years, Richard told me we had to be careful. All those years, Megan struggled. All those years, I deprived myself of basic things because my husband claimed money was tight, and he was hoarding cash in a safe. I felt physically sick, but the money wasn't even the worst part. Beneath the cash lay folders, documents, account statements, property deeds, and investment portfolios. Opening the first folder carefully, the numbers blurred for a second as tears rushed to my eyes. Investment account balances, retirement funds, private transfers. The amounts were so large I had to reread them. Richard hadn't just hidden savings, he had built an entirely separate financial universe, and I was never invited inside. My breath grew shallow as I kept turning pages. Some accounts were solely in Richard's name. Others? My heart stopped. On the other accounts, Linda Graves's name sat right next to his. Joint ownership, joint financial authority. I stared at the documents in disbelief. No, 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 no. This couldn't be happening. I leaned against a wall, trying to breathe through the dizziness, thinking for a terrifying second that I might actually faint. Seeing the evidence changes something inside you. Suspicion leaves room for denial, but documentation doesn't. I forced myself to keep reading. One document showed property ownership tied to a small rental apartment in Cincinnati. Another showed wire transfers dating back nearly 11 years. 11 years. I covered my mouth instantly. Richard had been secretly moving money for over a decade, and somehow, in all those years, I had never noticed. A memory hit me with sudden violence. Megan crying at our kitchen table over student loans, and Richard saying they couldn't touch the retirement funds, all while he hid investment accounts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. I felt a sharp anger that terrified me. Not a loud anger or a screaming anger, but an anger that went cold, dangerously cold. Mechanically, I kept searching through the folders, and then I found something else. Insurance documents. Life insurance. The beneficiary line made my chest tighten painfully. Linda Graves. Not me. Her. I stopped breathing entirely. My husband had designated another woman as the beneficiary on a major financial policy while sleeping beside me every night. I thought I was prepared for betrayal, but I wasn't. The tears came and I couldn't control them, not because of the money, but because suddenly every single loving memory felt contaminated. Every anniversary dinner, every I love you, every time Richard kissed my forehead before church. How many of those moments were real? Were any of them? The office suddenly felt suffocating. Standing up too quickly, I almost knocked over one of Richard's office chairs, my legs shaking violently beneath me. I walked to the window, trying to steady myself while rain washed over the glass. 38 years of loyalty, sacrifice, and trust, and all along, Richard was quietly preparing for a future I apparently wasn't deemed important enough to be included in. The discovery hollowed me out completely. But then, beneath the grief, another feeling began to surface. Clarity. For the first time in months, everything made sense. Richard's obsession with controlling the finances, the constant warnings about spending, the secrets, the hidden phone calls, and the emotional distance whenever money was mentioned. He wasn't protecting our future, he was protecting his own. Wiping the tears from my face slowly, I forced myself to think. Crying wasn't going to help me now. I needed evidence. I grabbed my phone and began taking pictures of everything. Every account number, every document, every transfer, and every signature tied to Linda. My hands grew steadier as I worked, not because I felt calmer, but because survival sometimes creates focus. Then I found a sealed envelope beneath the folders. Hesitating before opening it, I found a handwritten note inside. Not romantic or emotional, but practical and cold. It looked like instructions. Transfer schedules, account details, contingency plans, and a sentence near the bottom made my blood run cold. If suspicion arises, delay any major transfers until the retirement paperwork is finalized. I read it 3 times, then a 4th. My husband had actually written a plan for what to do if I discovered the truth. Dropping slowly into Richard's office chair, staring at those words, something inside me finally shattered completely. Not my heart, my illusion. The man I thought I married didn't exist. Maybe he never had. I don't know how long I sat there until a sudden crack of thunder outside pulled me back to reality. Richard could be home at any moment. Quickly, I put every document back exactly where I found it, aligning every folder, every stack of cash, and every piece of paper perfectly. Then I closed the safe, and the click sounded different this time. No longer mysterious, but final. Pushing the filing cabinet back carefully, I stood in the middle of the office and looked around the room. Nothing looked altered, yet everything had changed because now I knew the truth. My husband wasn't just hiding money. He was hiding an escape plan, one that clearly didn't include me. When Richard came home later that night holding the takeout boxes and smiling casually, I stood in the kitchen watching him take off his wet coat. "You're still up?" he asked warmly. I nodded slowly. "Couldn't sleep." He walked over and kissed my cheek. "I brought your favorite soup." Looking into his eyes directly for the first time in weeks, I realized something terrifying. Richard truly believed he was smarter than me. That belief had protected him for years, but now it was going to destroy him. For 2 days after opening the safe, I barely spoke to Richard unless absolutely necessary. It wasn't because I wanted to punish him, but because I was afraid that if I looked at him for too long, I'd say something I could never take back. It's strange how quickly grief transforms into numbness. I still made coffee every morning, still folded clothes, and still listened to Richard talk about grocery prices, church news, and the weather as if our marriage wasn't rotting beneath the surface. Meanwhile, numbers flashed constantly in my head. account balances, transfer amounts, property deeds, and Linda Graves listed as the beneficiary. Every time I thought of that detail, a sharp ache hit my chest. One evening, Richard reached across the dinner table and touched my hand lightly. "You've seemed very distant lately." I looked down at his fingers resting on mine, the exact same hands that had signed hidden financial documents behind my back for years. "I'm tired," I replied calmly. "You've been saying that a lot lately?" Looking up slowly, I met his eyes. Maybe I'm finally just exhausted. Something flickered across his face. Maybe concern, maybe suspicion. It didn't matter anymore. Later that night, after Richard fell asleep, I sat alone in the guest bathroom with the door locked, staring at my reflection in the mirror. I looked older than I remembered, not physically, but emotionally, like someone who had spent too much time apologizing for taking up space. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to honestly ask a terrifying question: what happens to me if I leave? At 62 years old, divorce didn't feel like freedom. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. I hadn't worked a full-time job in decades, and Richard controlled almost everything financially: the house, the retirement accounts, the investments. Until recently, I didn't even know where most of our money actually was. Fear immediately crept in. Maybe that's why women sometimes choose to stay. Not because the betrayal isn't real, but because rebuilding a life later in years feels impossible. The next morning, I searched for divorce lawyers online, my hands trembling as I typed the words while Richard showered upstairs. Experienced family attorneys, Columbus, Ohio. Clicking through profiles silently, one name caught my attention: Patricia Bennett. Family law specialist, 28 years of experience, hidden asset cases. That phrase accelerated my pulse instantly. Hidden assets. That was exactly what this was. Not a misunderstanding, not privacy, and not financial caution. It was hidden. Staring at the screen for a long time, I finally dialed the office number. A calm receptionist answered, "Bennett Family Law." I almost hung up, but instead I whispered, "I'd like to schedule a consultation." 3 days later, I told Richard I was going out for lunch. Technically, it wasn't a complete lie. I planned to see Megan afterward. But first, I drove downtown to Patricia Bennett's office, a manila envelope containing copies of every document hidden beneath the passenger seat. The law firm sat on the 3rd floor of a quiet brick building overlooking the river, smelling of coffee and expensive paper. I almost turned around twice before the receptionist called my name. "Mrs. Holmes." Patricia Bennett looked to be in her late 50s, wearing a sharp navy suit with a silver bob, and her calm eyes seemed to notice every detail instantly. She shook my hand firmly. "Come on in." The moment her office door closed behind me, I unexpectedly started crying. Not a dramatic sob, just silent tears that I apparently no longer had the strength to contain. Patricia handed me tissues without interrupting. "You're safe here," she said softly. The sentence almost broke me completely. Safe. I couldn't remember the last time I felt genuinely emotionally safe. Minutes later, I finally opened the envelope and pushed the copied files across her desk. Patricia began reading silently, her expression growing more serious the longer she looked. Finally, she looked up. "How long have you known these accounts existed?" "A few weeks." "And your husband controls all marital finances?" "Yes." "Did you have any knowledge of these assets before now?" "None." Patricia leaned back in her chair slowly. "Mrs. Holmes, this is substantial." My stomach tightened instantly. "What does that mean?" "It means your husband appears to have been intentionally concealing marital assets." Hearing those words said out loud felt surreal. I looked down at my hands. I kept feeling like maybe I was misinterpreting things. "You aren't." Her certainty comforted me just as much as it terrified me. Patricia tapped a document carefully. "These transfers involving Linda Graves are particularly concerning. Do you suspect an affair?" "I don't know," I admitted honestly. "I found her online. She doesn't look like a mistress. She looks like she's struggling financially too. Her name is on his consulting business files." She paused thoughtfully. "It's possible. But financially that actually matters less than what these records imply." "What do they imply?" "Your husband has spent years positioning capital outside of your awareness." The room suddenly felt cold. Years, not a mistake, and not temporary panic. Years. Patricia continued reading quietly while I fought to keep my composure, then asked softly, "Are you afraid of divorcing him?" I answered too quickly. "Yes." She nodded gently. "That's completely normal. I'm 62. That doesn't mean your life is over." Easy to say, I thought instantly. She had confidence, a career, and independence, while I had spent decades becoming smaller in my own marriage. As if reading my mind, Patricia leaned forward slightly. "Carly, can I ask you a difficult question?" I nodded weakly. Are you afraid of losing your husband? Her voice softened. Or are you afraid of finally seeing him for who he is? That question hit me harder than discovering the safe itself because deep down, I already knew the answer. I wasn't grieving the person sitting at my kitchen table every night. I was grieving the man I had believed existed for nearly 40 years. And those were two entirely different things. Tears filled my eyes immediately. Patricia let the silence sit for a moment before speaking again. From this point forward, you need to protect yourself carefully. How do I do that? First, keep gathering copies quietly. I nodded. Second, do not confront him yet. That surprised me. Why? Because the moment someone realizes you know about hidden assets, they usually move capital quickly. A chill immediately ran through me. Richard absolutely would do that. Patricia continued calmly. You need evidence before emotion. Evidence before emotion. The phrase felt like it carried a strange strength. For decades, Richard treated my emotion as weakness. Now, someone else was telling me that clear evidence mattered more. Patricia handed the folder back to me carefully. I also strongly advise opening a private bank account immediately, solely in your name. The idea felt almost rebellious, having my own account at 62 years old. It should have felt ordinary, but instead, it felt like a revolution. Before I left, Patricia studied me quietly one last time. You've spent a long time underestimating yourself, haven't you? I swallowed hard. I think my husband spent a long time encouraging me to do so. Patricia nodded slowly. It happens far more often than you think. When I finally walked back to my car, the autumn air somehow felt sharper, colder, but crisper. For the first time since discovering Richard's lies, I didn't feel crazy anymore. I wasn't imagining things, I wasn't overreacting, and most importantly, I wasn't powerless. The realization empowered me just as much as it terrified me, because now I understood one thing clearly. Richard Holmes had spent years quietly preparing for a life without me. He just never expected me to start preparing for a life without him first. Richard arranged our anniversary dinner 3 weeks after my meeting with Patricia Bennett. 38 years of marriage, that was what he proudly told everyone when booking the reservation. 38 years, as if duration automatically equaled loyalty. Dinner took place at the upscale steakhouse we had gone to for almost every anniversary since our 40s. Dark wood walls, soft piano music, and servers in black vests who immediately addressed Richard as Sir with respect. From the outside, we probably looked like a perfect older couple. Richard wore his charcoal blazer, smiling warmly at everyone we passed, while I sat beside him feeling like I was attending the funeral of my own marriage. You look beautiful tonight, he said as the server poured the wine. Hearing the compliment made me almost flinch, not because it sounded fake, but because Richard sounded completely sincere. That was the terrifying part. People imagine betrayal to be loud and obvious, but Richard still opened doors for me, still complimented my appearance, and still remembered how I liked my steak cooked. Manipulation wrapped in kindness is almost impossible to explain to anyone else. Thank you, I said calmly. Richard smiled. To 38 years. He raised his glass. I raised mine mechanically, but in my mind, a different thought echoed. To 38 years of not knowing who you actually were. Initially, dinner proceeded with painful normalcy, with Richard talking about church fundraising projects and Daniel's promotion at work while I nodded politely at the appropriate moments. Then, midway through the meal, he reached across the table and touched my hand lightly. I've been thinking lately, he said softly, about how incredibly fortunate we are compared to most couples. I stared at him. Fortunate? The word almost made me laugh out loud, but instead I asked carefully, why do you say that? Because we've survived everything. He smiled warmly. Most marriages don't last these days. It takes commitment. It takes honesty, and it takes loyalty. The word honesty almost stopped my breathing entirely. I looked down at my glass quickly, terrified that my expression would give everything away. The man sitting across from me was secretly moving capital into hidden accounts while lecturing me on loyalty. The hypocrisy felt unreal. Are you okay, Carly? Richard asked. Yes. You've seemed distant again lately. He said it lightly, but I heard the suspicion underneath. Richard was starting to notice the growing gap between us, and that realization forced me to be careful immediately. Patricia had warned me, do not confront him yet. So, I offered a weak smile. I'm just worried about Megan. Richard sighed softly, looking instantly annoyed. She'll be fine. She's struggling, Richard. She is completely overwhelmed emotionally. There it was again, Richard's favorite way to dismiss pain. She is raising a child on her own, I said calmly, and she'll be stronger for it. I stared at him in disbelief. You truly believe suffering builds character, don't you? Richard frowned slightly. That's not what I meant. It is exactly what you meant. For a brief second, the tension between us felt taut. Then Richard leaned back calmly. You've changed lately, Carly. The sentence hung heavily in the air. I picked up my water glass slowly. Maybe I'm just tired of always pretending everything's perfectly fine. His expression sharpened almost instantly. What does that mean? I almost answered honestly. Almost. But I forced a smile. It means getting older makes a person reflective, Richard. Richard relaxed slightly after that, and I suddenly understood something important. He still believed he was in control of the situation, in control of me. That belief gave me strength. After dinner, Richard insisted on ordering dessert, even though neither of us was hungry, and he slid a small velvet jewelry box across the table. Happy anniversary. Opening it slowly, I found a delicate gold bracelet inside. Beautiful, simple, and heartbreakingly sad. If this had happened years ago, the gesture would have brought happy tears to my eyes. Now, all I could think about was the hidden safe, the secret accounts, and the life insurance policy designating another woman as the beneficiary. I looked up carefully. It's beautiful. Richard offered a visible smile of satisfaction. I saw it last month and thought of you. The statement hurt more than I anticipated because once upon a time, I would have believed him completely. Maybe a part of him did think of me. Maybe that's why betrayal is so complicated. People can love you and betray you at the exact same time. Those truths can exist together. On the drive home, a light rain fell against the windshield while the car stereo played old jazz quietly. Richard rested one hand casually on the steering wheel. Do you remember our 10th anniversary? He asked suddenly. I swallowed hard. I do. We could barely afford a nice dinner back then. The irony almost choked me. Afford. All these years, Richard built our marriage on the myth of financial scarcity, and I had faithfully carried that burden right along with him. We made it through anyway, he continued proudly. Turning my head toward the dark window so he wouldn't see the rising anger on my face, I thought, no, Richard, I made it through. I made the sacrifices, I made the adjustments, and I shrank my life while you quietly prepared for an escape. By the time we got home, I felt emotionally hollowed out. Richard loosened his tie and walked toward the kitchen. I'm going to check on a few things in the office quickly. My heart skipped a beat instantly. Of course he was. Probably checking the safe. Probably checking the accounts. I kept my voice even. Okay. After Richard vanished into the office, I stood silently in the hallway. Seconds later, I heard the faint scrape of the filing cabinet against the floor, followed by silence. Holding my breath, Richard finally emerged a few minutes later looking relaxed and satisfied. That meant he hadn't noticed anything missing. Good. Very good. Later that night, after Richard fell asleep, I slipped out of bed quietly and went downstairs with my phone. Patricia suggested keeping careful records of everything, so over the past 2 weeks, I had started building a private digital folder filled with photos, account details, property deeds, and financial transfers. Now I added one more thing, a picture of the anniversary bracelet, because suddenly the gift itself carried a strange symbolism. A modest bracelet bought for the wife who sacrificed everything, while hundreds of thousands lay hidden elsewhere. Sitting alone in the dark living room afterward, staring at the glowing screen of my phone, another thought entered my mind unexpectedly. What if Richard was already moving the capital out? Fear immediately tightened in my chest. Patricia had warned me about that possibility. Opening the copied account documents again, I examined the dates carefully, and that was when I discovered something shocking. The most recent transfer occurred just 4 days ago. A substantial amount, very large. Zooming in on the photograph slowly, the receiving account once again contained Linda Graves' name. My breath grew shallow. Richard hadn't stopped. Even now, even while taking me to anniversary dinners, buying me jewelry, and talking about loyalty, he was still secretly transferring funds. The discovery permanently changed something inside me. Until that exact moment, a part of me still hoped that maybe Richard felt guilty, that maybe he regretted it, or that some broken piece of honesty remained deep inside him. But this was an ongoing, calculated, active betrayal. Sitting alone in the dark house we had built together, one thing became entirely clear. My husband wasn't preparing to save our marriage. He was preparing to survive without me. He just didn't realize I had already started preparing to survive without him, too. On a gray Thursday morning, I drove to Cincinnati without telling a soul where I was going. Not Richard, not Megan, and not even Patricia. A part of me knew it was reckless, but another part of me didn't care anymore. After weeks of staring at documents and hidden accounts, I needed to see Linda Graves with my own eyes. I needed her to be a real, living person, not just a shadow haunting my marriage. The drive took nearly 2 hours. Heavy gray clouds pressed down tightly over the highway as old country music played softly from the speakers. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. In my mind, I kept imagining different versions of her. A glamorous older woman living comfortably off my husband's money, a manipulative con artist, a secret mistress waiting quietly in another city. But deep down, the documentation had already told me the story wasn't going to be that simple. The address on the property records led me to a modest neighborhood filled with aging duplexes and narrow front porches. There was no wealth here, no luxury, just the quiet exhaustion of the average middle class. I parked across the street, staring at the faded greenhouse registered in Linda's name, my stomach churning violently. Twice, I almost turned the key to drive away. What did I honestly hope to achieve? But then I remembered Megan crying in that parking lot because she couldn't rent an apartment, while Richard was busy moving funds out of our lives. That memory hardened something inside me again. I stepped out of the car. As I walked up, the porch steps creaked softly under my shoes. I took a deep breath and knocked. For several seconds, there was no sound. Finally, footsteps moved slowly inside, and the front door opened halfway. In an instant, everything I expected shattered. Linda Graves didn't look like the kind of woman who steals someone else's husband. She looked entirely worn out, a deep, painful exhaustion. Her shoulders slumped under a faded sweatshirt, and her gray hair was tied back loosely. She had dark circles under her eyes that no amount of heavy makeup could ever truly hide. For a moment, she just stared at me. "Hello?" I swallowed hard. "Are you Linda Graves?" Her posture tensed instantly. "Yes. My name is Carly Holmes." The color drained from her face in a second. It wasn't guilt. It was terror. Pure, genuine terror. She gripped the edge of the door tighter. Oh my God. Her reaction startled me so much I almost forgot what I was going to say next. "You know who I am?" Linda closed her eyes briefly, like someone bracing for an impact. "Yes," she whispered. A painful silence stretched between us until she finally took a step back. "You'd better come inside." The house smelled faintly of coffee and old books. There was absolutely no sign of luxury. The furniture was old but carefully maintained, with no trace of hidden wealth anywhere. Linda gestured nervously toward the couch. "Can I get you some coffee?" "No, thank you." She nodded tensely and sat in an armchair across from me. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the question that had been poisoning my thoughts for weeks. "How long have you been with my husband?" Linda stared at me blankly. "With him? You know exactly what I mean, Linda." Her eyes widened suddenly. No, Carly, it's not like that at all." I offered a bitter look. "Your birthday's the combination to his safe." Linda looked genuinely bewildered for a second. Then a pained expression crossed her face. "Oh, heavens!" She covered her mouth. "He used that combination." I stared at her. "You didn't know?" "No," she said, her voice sounding entirely authentic. "I had no idea." I leaned forward slowly. "Richard has hidden accounts tied to your name. Properties, wire transfers, life insurance documents." Linda's shoulders sank completely, and to my absolute shock, her eyes filled with tears. "I told him this would happen eventually," she whispered. I froze. "What are you talking about?" Linda looked down at her hands, struggling to find the words. Finally, she whispered, "Richard never loved me, Carly." The words hit me from an angle I never saw coming. "What?" Linda looked up, completely drained. "He used me." I stared at her in disbelief. "What does that mean?" She stood up abruptly, walked to a small desk near the hallway, and returned with several folders. My stomach tightened. More files. Linda sat back down slowly. "I should have told someone years ago." "Told me what, Linda?" Her fingers trembled against the paperwork. After Richard retired from his corporate accounting position, he started moving capital through consulting accounts. He told me he needed privacy because he didn't trust changing investment regulations. I frowned. "That doesn't explain why your name is on everything." Linda swallowed hard. "Because the business documentation was put under my name. I signed the paperwork for him years ago." "Why would you do that?" Linda offered a tearful, bitter smile. "Because I was foolish." She paused, letting the silence sit, before continuing quietly. "My husband passed away 12 years ago, and I was in a terrible position financially. Richard told me he could help me earn extra income if I assisted with the administrative paperwork for his consulting firm." My pulse hammered. "Are you saying this was never an affair?" Linda shook her head instantly. "No, never." "Then why all the secrecy?" "Because what he was doing wasn't legal." The words landed like a stone in my chest. Staring at her, my entire understanding of the situation turned upside down once again. Linda wiped her tears, her voice shaking. "At first I thought it was harmless. He told me certain accounts needed to be separate for tax purposes, but they weren't separate, Carly." No, they weren't. I looked at the folders. How much money are we talking about? Linda looked visibly ill. I don't even know anymore. I leaned back slowly, trying to process everything. Richard hadn't been secretly funding another romance. He had been using Linda to secretly build an entirely separate financial identity. He used her, he used me, and he used everyone. Did he plan on leaving me? I asked quietly. Linda hesitated for far too long, and that hesitation was all the answer I needed. A fresh wave of humiliation washed over me. Finally, she whispered, "He talks sometimes about wanting freedom in retirement." Freedom. Such a simple word, yet hearing it almost broke me. Freedom from what? From me? From responsibilities? From the marriage I had spent nearly 40 years protecting? Linda looked at me with genuine sorrow. "I am so sorry, Carly." I let out a faint laugh. It wasn't because anything was funny, but because I suddenly realized how absurd it all was. For weeks, I had imagined this woman as my enemy, but sitting across from her now, all I saw was another older woman who had been manipulated by the exact same man, just in a different way. He made me feel like I was losing my mind, I admitted quietly. Linda nodded instantly. He is incredibly good at making himself sound perfectly reasonable. A chill ran through me because that described Richard flawlessly. No outbursts, no recklessness, just total, calculated control. He was dangerously convincing. Linda opened another folder slowly. "There's more you need to see." Inside were copies of additional transfers, commercial filings, and notes in Richard's handwriting. One specific line made my heart sink instantly. Gradually transfer remaining assets prior to final retirement separation. I looked up sharply. Retirement separation? Linda looked devastated. I believe he was planning to leave eventually. My vision blurred. It wasn't because I still wanted Richard, but because suddenly my entire marriage felt like a performance. It was as if I had spent decades playing the role of the devoted wife while my husband was quietly designing an exit strategy. Linda's voice shook. "I should have stopped helping him." "Why didn't you?" She lowered her gaze. By the time I understood what he was truly doing, I was already trapped in it. I sat there in silence for a long time, listening to the rain tap against the window. Two older women, both exhausted, both manipulated by the same man. For the first time since opening that safe, I understood clearly. This was never about romance. It was about control, money, and an escape. And Richard Holmes had spent years carefully arranging all three behind my back. I barely remember the drive home from Cincinnati. The highway blurred past my eyes as Linda's words repeated endlessly in my mind. He was planning to leave eventually. Every time I replayed that sentence, another memory cracked open beneath it. Richard insisting that financial independence was wise. Richard preventing me from returning to full-time work. Richard quietly controlling every major decision in our marriage while making it sound practical rather than entirely selfish. By the time I pulled into the driveway, it was dark. Richard's car sat in the garage, and I froze behind the wheel for a long time, staring at the warm kitchen light shining through the window. The house suddenly felt completely foreign. It wasn't because the furniture had changed, it was because I had. I walked inside clutching my purse, with the copies of Linda's documents hidden safely inside. Richard was standing by the counter making coffee. "Hey," he said casually, "you were out late." "I went to see Megan," I replied, offering another partial lie. "How is she doing?" "She's exhausted, Richard." He nodded sympathetically, pouring creamer into his mug. The performance almost commanded respect at this point. How could a person lie so calmly for so long? "Do you want some coffee?" he asked. "No." He studied my face carefully. "Are you sure you're okay, Carly?" For a dangerous second, I wanted to tell him the absolute truth. "No, Richard, I'm not. I know about the hidden accounts. I know about the sham business transfers. I know you spent years planning to walk away from our marriage while pretending to build a future together." Instead, I just said, "It's been a long day." Richard accepted the answer instantly. That hurt in its own way because after 38 years together, he still didn't truly see me. There was no depth, no honesty. That night, after he fell asleep, I took Linda's documents into the guest bathroom and locked the door. I spread every single page carefully across the tile floor, commercial filings, transfer histories, tax statements, and handwritten notes. The more I studied them, the clearer the pattern became. Richard hadn't just hidden money. He had slowly, quietly, and strategically moved assets away from our marriage over a long period of time. The realization made me physically ill. This wasn't a panic response or an act of desperation. This was a blueprint. I photographed everything, sending the copies to the private account Patricia had helped me establish. Then I noticed another item buried in the files, a retirement projection sheet. My pulse spiked. Near the bottom of the page, Richard had written notes calculating the estimated liquid assets post-separation. Post-separation, not if we separate, post-separation. That distinction broke something deep inside me. Sitting on the bathroom floor staring at those words, silent tears began to fall. All these years, I thought we were growing old together. Meanwhile, Richard was explicitly calculating how to ensure he remained financially untouched without me. Suddenly, a conversation from 3 years ago flashed into my mind. We were sitting on the back porch drinking iced tea, and I casually mentioned downsizing eventually. Richard had offered a strange smile and said, "Maybe we'll want different things one day." At the time, I thought he meant hobbies, travel, or lifestyle changes. Now I understood. He was already imagining a life without me. The next morning, I met with Patricia again. This time, I wasn't shaking. I was furious. True anger changes your posture, and Patricia noticed it immediately. "You found more," she stated. I handed her the folder. She flipped through the pages silently while I watched the city traffic outside her window. Finally, she let out a slow breath. "This is worse than I initially thought." My stomach tightened. "How bad is it?" "Your husband appears to have spent years intentionally structuring hidden assets." Hearing the clinical description made it feel even colder. Patricia continued carefully. "These handwritten calculations strongly suggest premeditation." I looked down at my hands. "He planned the entire thing." "Yes." The confirmation hurt more than I expected. It wasn't because I still doubted it, but because a part of me still hoped someone would tell me I had misread everything. But there was no room for interpretation anymore. Patricia tapped another page. "This also explains why he maintained financial control so aggressively." I looked up. "What do you mean?" "Carly, men who conceal assets over the long term often prevent their spouses from achieving financial independence. It minimizes scrutiny." The words felt like ice water thrown over me. Minimizes scrutiny. Suddenly, my entire marriage sounded like a case study rather than a relationship. I leaned back slowly. "He always made me feel like I was irresponsible with spending." Patricia nodded knowingly. "That's very common." Common. I hated that word because it meant women like me were everywhere. Women who slowly disappeared in marriages built on control disguised as protection. I swallowed hard. "Did he ever love me, Patricia?" She paused thoughtfully. "I can't answer that, Carly, but a person can love you and still prioritize themselves completely over your well-being." That brutal truth settled heavily between us. Before I left, Patricia asked softly, "Have you decided what you want to do?" The answer came easier than I thought. "Yes." It wasn't because I felt fearless, but because I finally understood something crucial. Richard had emotionally checked out of our marriage years ago. I was just the last one to find out. That afternoon, I paid an unexpected visit to Megan. She opened the door looking exhausted, while Liam sat at the kitchen table coloring superheroes. "Are you okay, Mom?" she asked immediately. I almost laughed. Clearly, my face could no longer hide my emotions. "I just wanted to see you." Megan studied me closely while making coffee. "Did you and Dad get into a fight?" "No." The answer was technically true. Fighting requires honesty, and we were long past that stage. Later, while Liam watched cartoons in the living room, Megan sat quietly beside me on the couch. Suddenly, she said something that startled me. "You know, growing up, I always felt like Dad treated you more like an employee than a wife." I turned to her sharply. "What?" She shrugged uncomfortably. "I don't know how to explain it." "Try, Megan." She hesitated. "He respected you, but everything always revolved around his decisions, his money, and his rules." Her simple observation left me breathless because children see what adults spend years denying. "I used to hate how careful you were around him," she admitted softly. I stared at her. "Careful? Like you were always trying to make sure he didn't get annoyed." A fresh wave of shame washed over me. It wasn't because Megan was judging me, but because she was entirely right. I had spent years emotionally managing Richard's moods without even realizing it. Megan touched my hand gently. "Mom, are you happy?" The question broke something inside me because I honestly didn't know anymore. Had I been happy, or had I just been stable? There is a difference, a painful one. When I returned home that night, I found Richard sitting in his office reviewing files. The scene no longer intimidated me. Instead, I saw him clearly for what he was, a man who spent years building a hidden escape route while his wife built a family around him. Richard looked up as I walked in. "Everything okay?" I looked right at him. "Everything is fine." For the first time in decades, I wasn't lying to protect his comfort. A decision was quietly forming inside me. Richard Holmes had spent years secretly planning his future, and now it was my turn to start planning mine. The morning I signed the divorce papers, The sky over Columbus was a painful shade of blue, clear skies and crisp autumn sunlight. That kind of peaceful morning somehow made the betrayal feel even crueler. Sitting in Patricia Bennett's office, the pen in my hand suddenly felt heavier than anything I had ever touched. 38 years. That was how long my marriage had lasted. It was long enough to raise children, establish traditions, and completely lose myself along the way. Patricia slid the final document toward me gently. "Take your time, Carly." I looked down at Richard's name printed neatly at the top of the page. Richard Allen Holmes. For a strange moment, a flood of memories washed over me. Our wedding day, our first apartment, the night Daniel was born, Richard teaching Megan to ride her bike, Christmas mornings, hospital visits, funerals, holidays, and ordinary Tuesdays. An entire lifetime compressed into one unbearable second. Then another memory cut through all the others. The hidden accounts, the secret transfers, the assets calculated post-separation, Linda's exhausted face, and Megan crying in the parking lot while Richard hid money. Slowly, I signed my name, Carly Holmes. The moment the pen left the paper, something unexpected happened. I didn't feel devastated. I felt calm. It wasn't happiness or complete relief, but absolute clarity, as if years of emotional fog had finally cleared away. Patricia organized the files carefully. "You did the right thing." I let out a soft laugh. If this had been a month ago, it would have terrified me to death. What changed? I thought about it for a long moment. I realized I've actually been living alone in this marriage for a very long time. Patricia nodded quietly. Before I left, she asked one final question. "How do you want to deliver the papers to him?" I looked out the window. People downtown were moving about with their coffee mugs and briefcases, completely unaware that my entire life had just shifted. "I know exactly where I want him to find them," I said. That evening, Richard came home unusually upbeat. "There's a church fundraiser next weekend," he said, loosening his tie. "Harold Simmons wants us both to attend." Harold. Richard's old friend from his corporate accounting days. The same man who once joked that if Richard wanted to, he could hide money so well the IRS would never find it. Everyone had laughed back then. Now the memory made my stomach turn. "I don't really feel like socializing lately," I replied calmly. Richard poured himself a bourbon, studying me. "You've been distant from everyone, Carly. Maybe because I can finally see you clearly now." But I just shrugged. He stepped closer slowly. "Did I do something wrong?" The question almost broke me emotionally. It wasn't because it sounded genuine, but because a part of him genuinely seemed confused. That's the scariest thing about certain people. If their betrayal happens slowly enough, they stop viewing it as betrayal. They call it strategy, protection, or preparation, while everyone else quietly bleeds around them. "I'm just tired," I answered again. Richard let out a soft sigh. "You keep saying that. You always give me a reason to be tired." He kissed my forehead and went upstairs to shower. The moment I heard the bathroom door close, I moved quickly, precisely, and calmly. My emotions had burned out weeks ago. I went straight into Richard's office, opened the safe, flipped through the folders, and carefully placed the divorce papers right on top where he couldn't miss them. My hands were remarkably steady. There was no shaking, no panic, just pure clarity. Then I added one more thing, a handwritten note. I stared at the blank paper for a full minute before writing. "I knew before you thought I knew." Simple, cold, and true. I placed the note directly on top of the documents and stepped back, staring into the safe for a few seconds at the hidden cash, the account folders, and the years of lies. Then I closed the door gently. Click. The sound felt entirely final. I pushed the filing cabinet back into place and went upstairs just as Richard emerged from the bathroom. "You okay?" he asked casually, drying his hair. Yes, and strangely, I truly was. That night, I slept better than I had in months. It wasn't because the situation was no longer painful, but because the waiting was finally over. The next morning, Richard left early for breakfast with Harold before heading to the church financial committee meeting. I spent the morning slowly cleaning the kitchen, anxiety fluttering in my chest. It could happen at any moment. At some point, he would open that safe, and the illusion would shatter. Around noon, my phone vibrated. It was Patricia. "Is everything in place?" "Yes." "Are you certain you want to do it this way?" I looked toward Richard's office. "He hid his real life in that safe, Patricia, so he can find the truth there too." After hanging up, I sat alone in the living room listening to the grandfather clock tick by the fireplace. Each sound felt sharper and louder, stretching the time unbearably long. Finally, around 3 in the afternoon, I heard Richard's car pull into the driveway. My heart rate picked up instantly. The front door opened. "Carly?" "I'm in here." Richard walked through the living room holding his church documents. He looked completely normal, entirely unaware that his entire life was about to crack wide open. "How was your meeting?" I asked calmly. "Long." He unfolded his tie. "I need to check something in the office quickly." The moment had arrived, the defining one. I nodded quietly. "Okay." Richard disappeared down the hallway. Seconds later, I heard the office door open, followed by a long, heavy silence. My pulse beat so hard I could barely breathe. Then came the sound of the filing cabinet scraping against the floor. Another pause. And finally, "What on earth?" The shock in his voice turned my blood to ice. It wasn't because he sounded angry, it was because he sounded afraid. I sat perfectly still. A few seconds later, heavy footsteps stormed down the hallway. Richard appeared in the living room, holding the divorce papers in one hand and my note in the other. His face looked genuinely pale. "What is this?" I looked up calmly. "You already know what it is." Richard stared at me in disbelief. "How did you open the safe?" The question almost made me laugh. It wasn't "Why are you divorcing me?" or "What happened to us?" It was just the safe. "I watched you open it." His breathing grew shallow. "You went through my private papers?" "Private," I repeated softly. "You concealed marital assets for years, Richard." Richard froze completely. For the first time in our marriage, he had no immediate answer, no calm explanation, and no polished logic. There was only silence until he finally whispered, "You don't understand what you're looking at?" I stood up slowly. "No, Richard, I finally do." His expression shifted rapidly between panic and anger. "You had no right to do this." "No right?" I interrupted calmly. "I spent 38 years believing we were struggling financially while you built secret accounts behind my back." "It's not what you think." "Then explain Linda Graves." The name hit him visibly, and Richard looked away instantly, far too quickly. In that moment, I knew he was trapped, and he never expected me to become strong enough to confront him. Richard stared at me like I was a complete stranger. Not his wife, not the woman who raised his children. The divorce papers trembled slightly in his hand, and my note was crushed in his fist. "I can explain," he finally said. Decades of habit told me that sentence should soften my heart, but it didn't anymore. I slowly crossed my arms. "Go ahead." Richard opened his mouth, then closed it, completely at a loss for words for the first time in his life. Then came the anger. Not explosive, but controlled. The kind Richard always used when cornered. "You had absolutely no right to violate my privacy in my office." I almost laughed. "That's your defense? That I violated your privacy?" "Privacy?" I raised my voice for the first time in weeks. "You hid hundreds of thousands of dollars from your wife." Richard's jaw tightened. "You don't understand how finances work." There it was again, the exact same line he had used for years, delivered with that same quiet arrogance. Only this time, it didn't intimidate me. "I understand completely now." "No, Carly, you're being emotional." The word hit me like gasoline on a fire. Emotional. As if betrayal should be analyzed calmly like a spreadsheet, and as if a woman's pain is invalid the moment she cries. "You planned a future without me," I said flatly. Richard rubbed his forehead hard. "That's not true." "You wrote it down in your own notes, Richard. Liquid assets post-separation." His expression changed instantly. For the first time since we started confronting each other, genuine panic flashed in his eyes as he realized exactly how much I knew. "You copied the files?" he asked slowly. "Yes." "How much?" "Everything." A heavy silence collapsed around us. Then Richard did something entirely unexpected. He sat down heavily, as if his legs had suddenly lost their strength. I watched him carefully from across the room. It was the first time I'd ever seen my husband completely lose control of a situation. "2he muttered softly, looking down. He shook his head. "You spoke to someone." "A lawyer." He closed his eyes briefly. Of course he knew. Richard was always quick to read the system. "That woman manipulated you." I stared at him in disbelief. "You manipulated me for 38 years. This is ridiculous." "Is it?" Richard snapped back to his feet. "I protected this family." "No," I snapped. "You protected yourself." His face went rigid. "You have no idea what pressure feels like." "Pressure?" I offered a bitter smile. "Megan came to you begging for help, and you had money hidden in a safe." "That's entirely different." "It is exactly the same thing," I challenged. "How is it different?" Richard turned to me harshly. "Because Megan, just like you, makes decisions based entirely on emotion." The room went completely dead silent. Just then, Daniel stepped into the room, staring at his father in absolute shock. For the first time in my son's life, he truly saw Richard for who he was. Not the calm provider, not the wise father, but just a man desperately trying to excuse his own selfishness. Right at that moment, the front door opened again. It was Megan. She walked in carrying Liam's backpack and immediately sensed the heavy tension. What's going on? Nobody spoke. Then Daniel silently handed the papers to her. Megan read them quietly, her face changing completely midway through. You had money? Richard took a step forward. Megan, you had money this whole time? It's complicated. Tears filled her eyes instantly. Oh my God. Megan, listen to me. No, she yelled suddenly. You sat there and watched me drown. Richard stiffened. That's not fair. Not fair? Her voice cracked dramatically. I worked double shifts while you kept cash hidden in a safe. Liam appeared quietly near the hallway, looking terrified. I immediately walked over to him. It's okay, sweetie. But nothing was okay anymore. The illusion that held our family together had completely shattered. Daniel sat heavily on the couch, staring at the files as if he no longer recognized his own father. Megan was crying openly now, and Richard looked around the room, his expression like a man watching his control vanish in real time. For decades, he had carefully managed every narrative. But when everyone sees the lie together, the collapse is different. Standing in the middle of our living room, surrounded by the family he claimed to protect, Richard Holmes finally stood exposed. He wasn't strong, he wasn't wise, he was just entirely afraid. 3 weeks later, Richard sat across a table from me in a downtown mediation office, looking like he hadn't slept in days. I felt the same, but the exhaustion showed differently on our faces. Richard looked agitated. I looked resolved. The room itself felt painfully neutral. Beige walls, a long conference table, and cooling coffee next to untouched legal pads. There were no family photos here, and wedding rings didn't matter anymore. There were only facts, figures, and paper trails. The truth had been reduced to documentation. Initially, Richard avoided looking at me directly. That alone told me how much things had shifted. For nearly 40 years, he controlled every room he walked into. Now he looked like a man frantically calculating his losses. The mediator, an older woman named Janet Collins, folded her hands carefully. The goal today is resolution, she said calmly. Richard offered a rigid nod. Patricia remained expressionless, and I just sat quietly, watching the man I used to trust more than anyone in the world. Janet turned to Richard first. Mr. Holmes, your attorney indicates there may have been a financial misunderstanding within the marriage. Patricia almost laughed beside me. Financial misunderstanding. Everyone was trying to use polite language to soften the betrayal. Richard cleared his throat. I handled our finances throughout the marriage. Certain investments were structured separately for tax purposes. Patricia immediately slid several documents across the table. These tax structures involved transfers of marital assets that were concealed for approximately 11 years. Richard's jaw tightened. His lawyer, Stephen, quickly cut in. We dispute the characterization of concealed. Patricia remained calm. Then perhaps you can explain why Mrs. Holmes was excluded from account access, beneficiary information, and the properties involved. Silence. Richard shifted uncomfortably. The mediator studied the files. These accounts total a very substantial amount. Substantial. Another polite word. Patricia opened another folder. We also have evidence suggesting a deliberate plan regarding asset protection post-separation. Richard snapped his gaze to me, not with anger, but with a wounded look, as if he still couldn't believe I had actually fought back. That look hurt almost more than the lies themselves, because deep down, Richard genuinely believed I would stay silent forever. Patricia slid the handwritten retirement notes across the table. Janet adjusted her glasses, reading them quietly before looking directly at Richard. Did you write this? A long pause. Yes. What exactly did you mean by liquid assets post-separation? Richard let out a heavy breath. I was preparing for potential instability in the future. The answer sounded so cold and corporate that even Stephen looked slightly embarrassed. Patricia leaned forward slightly. Are you referring to divorce? Richard's silence answered for him. I thought hearing him cornered like this would make me feel angry, but instead I just felt tired, weary of the excuses, the manipulation, and watching him search for clever language to erase years of dishonesty. Janet turned to me gently. Mrs. Holmes, what is the final outcome you are seeking today? The question caught me off guard, because a month ago, my answer would have been emotional. I want justice. I want him to hurt the way I hurt. But sitting there now, I understood something important. I didn't need revenge anymore. I needed peace. I am asking for what is fair, I said calmly. Richard lowered his head immediately. That reaction mattered more than words, because somewhere deep down, even he knew fairness was something he never intended to give me. After that, Patricia methodically continued presenting the evidence. Transfer logs, hidden accounts, the joint filings tied to Linda Graves, the retirement planning notes, and property deeds. The more documents displayed, the quieter Richard became. Finally, Janet asked the question everyone had been avoiding all morning. Who exactly is Linda Graves? Richard rubbed his face slowly with both hands. An administrative assistant from my consulting work. Patricia immediately pushed another folder forward. Ms. Graves is prepared to provide a deposition regarding the hidden asset arrangements as well. Richard's head snapped up. She's what? Patricia's voice remained even. She has cooperated fully with the investigation. For the first time, I saw genuine panic cross Richard's face. Not frustration or annoyance, but fear. Linda was the one person helping him maintain the illusion, and now, even that protection was gone. Stephen leaned into Richard, whispering anxiously, but Richard barely seemed to hear him. He suddenly looked utterly exhausted and old. For years, I imagined a confrontation like this would feel victorious. Instead, it just felt sad. Beneath all the anger and betrayal sat an unavoidable truth. I had loved this man deeply once. And now we were sitting across from each other, discussing our marriage like a failed business contract. Patricia spoke again. Mrs. Holmes sacrificed career progression and financial independence throughout the marriage under repeated representations of limited finances. Janet nodded thoughtfully. That creates significant equity issues. Richard suddenly snapped, I worked my entire life for this family. I looked at him calmly. I gave my entire life to this family too, Richard. The room went completely quiet because both statements were true, but only one of us had secretly protected themselves at the expense of the other. Richard stared at me for a long time before asking softly, Was any part of it real to you, Carly? The question startled everyone, including me. I answered honestly, my voice trembling slightly. Yes, that's why this hurt so badly. Richard looked away instantly. For the first time since everything collapsed, he seemed unable to escape the heavy, emotional weight of what he had done. It wasn't just the money, it was the deception, the years, and the slow erosion of trust. Janet finally called for a brief recess. I walked out into the hallway alone, holding a paper cup of coffee I didn't actually want. Seconds later, Daniel unexpectedly appeared near the elevators. I blinked in surprise. What are you doing here, Daniel? He shoved his hands into his pockets uncomfortably. I wanted to see you, Mom. Something inside my chest softened instantly. My son looked exhausted too, carried by guilt and looking ashamed. I should have seen it, he admitted softly. It wasn't your fault, Daniel. I always believed him. I looked down at my coffee cup. So did I. Daniel swallowed hard. I keep thinking back to things now. What things? The way Dad talked to you sometimes, the money stuff, how you were always so careful around him. Careful. Megan had used the exact same word weeks ago. It's funny how children notice emotional patterns long before parents admit them. Daniel lowered his voice. I thought that was just how marriage was supposed to look. Looking at my son, I realized a painful truth. Richard hadn't just shaped me, he had shaped our children's understanding of relationships too. I touched Daniel's arm gently. Listen to me carefully. He nodded. That pattern ends with me. His face filled with emotion immediately. When we returned to the mediation room afterward, Richard looked smaller, stripped of his confidence. Janet calmly reviewed the final proposal. The division of assets, retirement allocation, property settlements, and legal disclosures. Patricia negotiated firmly beside me, while Richard remained mostly silent. Then, after hours of intense tension, Stephen leaned into his client one last time. Richard listened quietly, then offered a slow, defeated nod. I agree, he said softly. There was no dramatic speech, no outburst, just surrender. Janet let out a soft breath. Then we have a settlement framework. I looked at Richard across the table one final time. He seemed poised to say something, maybe an apology or an explanation, but in the end, he just stared at me. His expression was that of a man realizing entirely too late that the person he had underestimated for decades was finally no longer afraid. Strangely, that became the true end of our marriage. Not the hidden money or the divorce papers, but the exact moment I no longer needed his approval to survive. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I stood barefoot in my tiny backyard holding a hose, water spraying over rows of newly planted lavender. The air smelled fresh with earth and spring rain. For the first time in years, I felt peaceful. It wasn't ecstasy or a sense of triumph, just peace. It's funny how people think freedom should arrive like fireworks. For me, it came quietly in tiny moments. Brewing coffee in a kitchen where nobody criticized how much I spent on groceries, buying flowers just because I liked them, and opening my own bank account without a single ounce of fear. I was sleeping through the night, no longer wondering what secrets lay behind a locked door. After the settlement, I moved into a small, single-story house about 15 minutes away from Megan's apartment. It wasn't extravagant. 2 bedrooms, cream-colored walls, and a little porch swing I fell in love with instantly. Richard kept the big house, and strangely, I didn't care at all. Somewhere along the way, I realized that big house had never truly been a home. Peace is what makes a home, and peace cannot survive where trust has slowly died. Megan helped me decorate every room after I moved in. One afternoon, while hanging curtains, she suddenly started laughing. "What's funny?" I asked. "You're smiling, Mom. You're just constantly smiling." I blinked. "Am I?" "Yes." She watched me closely. "You didn't used to smile like that." The comment stayed with me for days afterward, because I hadn't even realized how long I had lived with that physical tension inside my body. Always careful, always adjusting, and always trying to maintain the emotional balance around Richard. Now, the silence felt different, lighter. My body seemed to understand freedom even before my brain fully caught up. Liam loved the new house instantly, especially the backyard. "Grandma," he proudly announced one Saturday while planting tomatoes beside me, "this place just feels happy." Children always know. They feel emotional truth much faster than adults. A few weeks later, Daniel came over on his own carrying a toolbox. "I noticed your kitchen cabinet doors are hanging slightly crooked," he said awkwardly. I smiled gently. "Come on in." We spent the afternoon fixing small things around the house while classic rock played quietly on the radio. At one point, Daniel stopped turning a screw and looked at me seriously. "I owe you an apology, Mom." I set my coffee mug down slowly. "For what, Daniel?" "For believing Dad instead of you for so long." Emotion tightened in my chest instantly. "You were trained to trust him, Daniel." "That's no excuse." Looking at my tall son standing in my small kitchen with tears gathering in his eyes, I suddenly didn't see an adult man anymore. I saw the little boy who used to run into my arms after a nightmare. "I should have noticed how he treated you," he whispered. Before he could say anything else, I stepped forward and hugged him tightly. "Listen to me carefully." He nodded against my shoulder. "You are not responsible for your father's choices. But, no." I pulled back gently. "The best thing you can do now is build something healthier in your own life." Daniel wept quietly after that, and so did I, because healing a family sometimes begins the exact moment someone finally speaks the truth out loud. Richard called a few times during those first few months after the divorce. Initially, I answered occasionally out of habit. The conversations always followed the same pattern: regrets, excuses, and confusion. "You ruined our entire life over money," he said bitterly once. I remember standing in my garden, gripping the phone tightly. "No, Richard," I replied calmly. "You ruined it with lies." Silence followed, and then finally, "I never stopped loving you." The statement hurt worse than anger, because maybe he genuinely believed it. Maybe a part of him did love me in the only way he knew how. But love without honesty eventually turns into something else: control, possession, and dependency. And I was no longer confusing those things with devotion. After a while, I stopped answering his calls entirely. It wasn't out of cruelty, but because every conversation pulled me emotionally backward into a past I had worked entirely too hard to finally move away from. On a Tuesday morning about 8 months after the divorce, I attended a local art class for older women at the community center. The old version of me would have never gone. Too expensive, too unnecessary, and too indulgent, at least according to the rules I had followed for decades. But now I sat alongside widows, retirees, and women reinventing themselves after heartbreak, painting terrible watercolors and laughing harder than I had in years. A woman named Eleanor looked over at me during class and smiled. "You look so much lighter lately, Carly." I offered a soft chuckle. "I think I finally stopped apologizing for taking up space." She raised her coffee mug toward me. "That'll change your entire life." She was right. Because between the divorce settlement, the small backyard, the lavender plants, and the awkward art classes, I had found myself again. Not the younger version, and not the woman from before Richard, but someone completely new, someone stronger. As evening approached, I sat alone on my porch swing, watching the birds settle into the trees, a warm breeze moving through the block. My phone vibrated gently beside me. It was a text from Richard. "I miss you." 3 simple words. Once upon a time, they would have undone me completely. Now, I just stared at the screen silently. Then, I placed the phone face down beside me and turned back to watch the fading sunset. Because missing someone doesn't erase what they did to you, and loneliness is not the same thing as a willingness to carry accountability. For years, I thought the greatest thing a woman could do was preserve her marriage at all costs. Now I understand better. Sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do is refuse to disappear inside someone else's version of love. The truth is, Richard didn't just steal money from our marriage. He stole years of certainty, years of confidence, and years where I truly believed my needs were less important than his plans. But in the end, he lost something too. Not the house, and not the accounts. Me. And strangely, that was the one thing he had never protected himself against, because the woman he underestimated for decades finally learned how to survive without his permission. If I learned one single thing from all of this, it's that betrayal rarely begins with a massive lie. It starts in tiny moments, moments where your voice gets quieter and quieter until you stop trusting your own instincts. I spent years believing that sacrifice was love. It isn't. Real love doesn't require one person to become invisible just so the other can feel powerful. If you are reading this later in years, please listen to me carefully. It is never too late to reclaim yourself. Not at 62, not at 70, and not after divorce, heartbreak, betrayal, or disappointment. Your life still belongs to you. Sometimes, healing begins the exact moment you stop begging someone to finally value you, and you simply start valuing yourself. If this story touched you in any way, I'd truly love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had to reinvent yourself after betrayal or heartbreak later in life? Where are you watching from tonight? I read the comments far more often than you think, because your stories matter just as much. If you loved Carly's journey, please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more emotional stories about family resilience and finding your strength after life breaks your heart.